I understand that knee-jerk reaction to that photo being like, why is this a thing? So, like, once it's pointed out that, it may be a thing for a reason, if you have already jumped on the bandwagon of demonizing something that turns out to then become ableist, is to remember that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you did something that was ableist, and you're perfectly capable of changing and, jumping off of that bandwagon, or, taking that bandwagon in a more inclusive direction. So don't just double down and rationalize. Actually try and fix the problem.
Hey there, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health, a podcast about chronic illness, disability, medical traumas, and everyday uncomfortable healthcare experiences. My name is Cara. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm just a person and a patient who really wants to talk about this stuff more. Nothing said on the show should ever be considered medical advice. If you're experiencing a medical issue, please seek qualified medical help. I know the system sucks, but I wish you a lot of luck. Every person is different, even within disease groups, so none of my guests should ever be regarded as official representatives or spokespersons for their conditions. Please respect their very personal choices, and unless they ask for it, please don't make suggestions about treatments or lifestyle changes. Unsolicited medical advice is never not annoying. This week's episode is about something that happened on and then off Twitter in the past week that dovetails with many issues affecting disabled people. The situation has been most heated where environmentalism, accessibility, and food politics collide, which is something that I spend a pretty ridiculous amount of time thinking about. Kim Sauder, a PhD candidate in disability studies, wrote a wonderful piece about it on her blog, The Crippled Scholar, so I asked her about it, because I found myself baffled by it as I watched this situation escalate. So I'm going to let her give you a little explainer on exactly what went down with what has now become known as Orange Gate.
How it all started was someone found a picture, it wasn't even their own picture as I understand it, of a grocery shelf at Whole Foods somewhere in the States, which had plastic containers with peeled oranges in it, and kind of thought that this was really bizarre and really anti-environmental, and made a tweet kind of mocking it. And basically being like, I don't understand why you would do this. And I can understand that basic, knee-jerk reaction. I would probably have it too. But then I would remember, oh, right, I can't peel oranges, and this is really convenient. So I understand, how that reaction came about. But then they tried to have it, and successfully had the product removed from Whole Foods. And throughout that whole thing, disabled people started popping up and saying, actually, hey, this is really accessible, and we would like to see this continue to be a thing and continue and actually be available in more places. And then a whole bunch of people claiming environmentalism basically jumped down our throats, saying that there was no valid reason why we would be able to ask for this. And unfortunately, it didn't just stay on Twitter. It's now off of Twitter. I found, I think, at least 4 or 5 mainstream news articles that are now dealing with this. Several of them don't even mention the disability aspect, and some of the ones that do so in a really mocking and minimizing sort of way. And if you try and engage with people in the comments on these stories, they're very much refuse to, remotely accept that there might be a reason to have these. And one of my big things that I've been asking people is, yes, I get the environmental aspect. I care about the environment too. Can we start looking at ways, instead of just being like, this product can't exist, can we find a way to, mesh environmentalism and accessibility? And they just refuse to engage on that level.
If you've never had any experience with disability and or chronic illness and aren't close with anyone who has, it might be hard to imagine why people, especially young people, might have a hard time peeling an orange and therefore have a use for pre-peeled citrus fruit. Like Kim said in the opening clip, it's not unreasonable for people to look at that photo and see the ridiculousness over the potential for accessibility. This is largely because even though people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States, disability has been almost entirely erased from our culture. It's perceived, if at all, as something very marginal, affecting only a small portion of the population. So accessibility is often an afterthought, an accident, or ignored altogether. But there's an awful lot more of us than most people realize. Listener Lynette shared with me her reasons for buying pre-prepared food. She's a 22-year-old from Michigan who lives with ankylosing spondylitis, reactive arthritis, and fibromyalgia. Symptoms like chronic pain, dexterity, and mobility issues, as well as brain fog and fatigue, can make cooking and independence a challenge, like she explains.
I did live alone while I was in college, and I had my own apartment, and sometimes my hands just hurt so bad that it's literally dangerous for me to even cut food or prepare it, so how am I supposed to feed myself? And grocery stores in my area do have pre-cut, pre-prepared food, so I can at least have them in some sort of soup or something. Even just diced onions. And people are like, oh, well, you're so lazy, you can't do that by yourself. And I'm like, you're right. I can't do that by myself. But I am by no means lazy. This is just what's safer for me. And I honestly feel horrible that sometimes I can't cut a carrot or an onion. My hands just shake so bad that I'm terrified I'm going to cut myself. I mean, it's actually just a hazard to myself and my well-being. And I'm 22 years old and I have a hard time peeling halos or cuties, which I love, and they're supposed to be easy peel. Easy peel for who? Not for me. They're not easy to peel for me. It's like trying to open a coconut for me sometimes. I try my best, and I do recycle a lot of the packaging and unnecessary things that I can recycle, but in all due honesty, it's just easier for me, and sometimes I just wish that I had somebody that could just cut up my vegetables once a week, so I wouldn't have to deal with this and deal with people constantly calling me lazy.
And it's not just people with mobility and dexterity disabilities. Pre-prepared and prepared food help people with a variety of disabilities, though most of these solutions are not universally accessible. There are plenty of disabled people for whom even that orange container is still inaccessible, but it wasn't really designed with accessibility in mind, let alone universal accessibility, which is something quite difficult to achieve even when you are doing it on purpose. This situation could, of course, spin off into a million other conversations. Chief among them would be the cost of being disabled and the socioeconomic issues that keep so many disabled people in poverty. Let's be honest, the majority of disabled people are likely not shopping at Whole Foods. Many disabled people simply can't afford to spend extra at a fancy pants grocery store or on pre-cut produce, and often don't get access to fresh produce at all. And this could spin off into another conversation about how we're told that cooking and eating a whole food diet is simpler and superior, and if we just ate better, we'd get better, which, as we've talked about many times on this show, is an oversimplification of how all of this stuff works. I've been thinking about this situation a lot over the past few days. Frankly, far more than I'd like to, because this whole thing about the oranges is just so ridiculous. I find it ridiculous because the oranges themselves are a red herring. We can jump down the rabbit hole of 10,000 arguments from either side of this issue, but as Kim points out, it gets us no closer to making the world a more accessible place, no closer to making the world a greener place, and no closer to making so-called progressive movements more inclusive to the disabled people they so often leave behind. When reading those comments from people on the anti-peeled orange side of this, one thing I saw frequently was some variation on the phrase, "Why don't you just..." And you can fill in that blank with any number of allegedly simple solutions to a very complex problem. I've encountered this in my own life too, when attempting to explain to people why I find something difficult or inaccessible. Cooking, which I've had to give up almost entirely, is a perfect example of this. There are so many places in the process at each step of the way, in meal planning, grocery shopping, prepping, cooking, eating, and then cleaning up afterwards, that I run into barriers. Many of those barriers are multi-layered, which makes it all extremely daunting. Sure, it's not impossible, and for some people, cooking is an integral part of their self-care strategy. But as a person with extreme extremely limited energy resources, I have to very carefully consider how I use that energy. But every time I try to talk to somebody who does not live with these issues about the fact that I find cooking too difficult to do on a regular basis, they almost instantly snap back with suggestions of, why don't you just get groceries delivered, or get something like Blue Apron, or hire a housekeeper, or buy adaptive cooking tools, or get a stool to sit on while cooking. The list can go on forever. I could do any and all of those things and still have a really hard time cooking and feeding myself. All of which goes without saying that many of those measures are prohibitively expensive and cost money that I, as a disabled person who is unable to work, do not have. Instead, I wind up getting prepared food, which is also expensive and not the best use of my limited and dwindling financial resources. It's not good for the environment. It's not ideal, but it is often my best option. And feeding myself is still a huge source of stress and anxiety for me. This is not a request for your advice on how to feed myself. Please don't give me any of that. And that why don't you just reflect seems to me to be the same, or at least related to the phenomenon of unsolicited medical advice. And if you listen to this show regularly, you know just how much I love unsolicited medical advice. It is almost always ill-informed and obnoxious, and so are rigid, unsolicited suggestions for accessibility measures. You'll almost always get it wrong, so just don't do it. Pro tip: if a disabled person tries to tell you about their experience and explains why something is difficult or inaccessible to them, instead of making suggestions about something that I promise you they've already thought of, listen. And if you still insist on talking, ask how you can help. You can find additional comments and threads from actual disabled people in the Storyfy I linked to in the show notes. I did not include the negative pushback on purpose as a self-care measure for myself because so many of those comments were mean, aggressive, ableist, and very quickly and easily crossed over into eugenics territory. But if you poke around those tweets that I compiled or the OrangeGate hashtag, you'll find them quite easily. At the bottom of Kim's post, which I've also linked to in the show notes, are some examples of press about the oranges and reactions to it, which was what moved me to do an episode about this. The truth is, being disabled and or chronically ill is often in direct conflict with environmentalism, and it's something that many of us feel a tremendous deal of guilt about. We talk about some of that in this episode, but something that I saw many people bring up on Twitter that we didn't quite get to in our conversation is the detritus of living with chronic illness. This, of course, varies by person, treatment, abilities, and condition, but many of us live every day with guilt about the footprint our health conditions cause us to have. For example, for those of us with hydration needs, our lives may be a graveyard of Gatorade or Powerade bottles. For those with a port for IV fluids or medication, there is a tremendous amount of sterile supplies that are single-use to avoid potentially deadly infections. And the same goes for anyone with a feeding tube, catheter, ostomy, or plenty of other medical equipment. This is also true for people who take injectable medications. Medical waste is often considered a biohazard and not recyclable for safety reasons. And don't even get me started on how many pill bottles we go through. While there may be some solutions to some of these problems, expecting chronically ill and disabled people to conform to a rigid standard of sustainability is unrealistic and not at all inclusive. And resisting feedback from actual disabled people won't get us anywhere either. As Kim points out, it's possible for us to work together to find more sustainable and accessible solutions to these problems, instead of aspiring to a future where disability and its inconvenient truths no longer exist. The environment is definitely in trouble, and here in the US, we for sure have a problem with excessive waste, especially when it comes to food. As my terrible high school environmental science teacher used to always say, the planet will always be here. Whether we still are is up to us. And while that statement has a few problems, it's a pretty good way to understand why sustainability does matter. We all need to be thinking about ways we can reduce our footprints, but there's much bigger fish to fry than OrangeGate. As always, you can find Kim's blog, The Crippled Scholar, and the reference post in the show notes, as well as reactions from other disabled people in the Storyfy I created. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. If you have any experience with the collision of sustainability and accessibility, or have some ideas about how we can better bring those two things together, email me at insicknesspod@gmail.com. I'm also still looking for 1 or 2 more people to help us with transcriptions of the episodes, so the show itself can be more accessible. So if you're interested in helping me out with that, please contact me. I hope you enjoy this episode. I want to say it's shocking, but it's not shocking, just given how I've seen people react to people pointing out ableist language or actions or, attitudes. I want to say I'm shocked by it, but I'm not. But the thing that's most jarring to me is the level of commitment with which the people who are going after this are doing it. There are some people who have been like, oh, that's an interesting point. I'm going to remove myself from the conversation now, or let's see if we can talk about some more, like you were saying, environmental and accessible solutions to this. But there's this other contingent that is aggressively defending their stance that this is wasteful and has no purpose. And it's just so surprising to me that or like I said, I want it to be surprising that people would be so resistant to somebody saying, hey, this is actually really helpful for me. And without something like this, I don't get vitamin C.
Yeah, and then they're like, drink juice. Except for the fact that, I think there have been more than a few studies that show that drinking juice is not the best way to get vitamin C. It's not as healthy as, actually eating an orange.
Right. And you're just getting the sugar.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. It's so bananas to me. No pun intended with the fruit situation. Yeah, it's something that you point out in the piece that you wrote about this is the anger about laziness. And this came up in another conversation that I had for the podcast. I think it was episode 18. My guest was talking about, being a person who's overweight and needs to use a motorized wheelchair. And they get these rage reactions from people who think that the only reason this person is using a motorized wheelchair is because they're lazy.
Yeah.
And not because they actually need it. And like you point out in your piece, that's definitely at play here as well. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is the funny thing is I think that there is to a degree an argument to say that society has gotten somewhat lazier. But from an accessibility standpoint, I'm just let's embrace the laziness, because the second you create something for those lazy people over there who are just genuinely lazy, you are making something accessible.
Yeah.
So embrace the laziness. I mean, sure, you might want to deal with the people that are genuinely lazy, but, aren't life hacks, the biggest thing on the internet right now? And most of those are just, how to make stuff more accessible. But the second something accessible is, pointed out, they're like, that's evil, get rid of it. And so it's that connotation of the fact that it's now connected with disability that I think people feel really comfortable just being that's not a good enough reason.
But why?
And
I don't understand.
As I said, I don't understand it. As I say, I've been engaging with people, and some of it has been trolls that I have now muted on Twitter because they were just straight up trolls who were trying to pretend they were being reasonable, but then eventually downgraded into calling me a dyke and making handicapped jokes, so basically showing their true colors. But when you sort of engage, I was on the tree hugger article, which is linked in my blog post at the end. People just keep trying to get the moral high ground anytime you kind of say, yes, this is true, but we need to consider how this affects disabled people. They're always oh, well, just ask someone in the store to peel it for you.
Yeah,
and,
when I got to that part.
And pretend, and I said, well, that's just another hoop we have to jump through. And they're like, well, we don't see it as a hoop. And I'm like, well, it is. Not only is it a hoop, because this whole thing is now, couched in this laziness narrative, if you go and ask someone, suddenly they're going to start judging, is this person actually disabled enough to be asking me for assistance? And heaven forbid you don't want to eat that orange right away, and you ask for a container to put it in so you can take it home with you.
Right.
So, and like, if that's a thing, are they just going to allow everyone to go and ask store staff? And again, and they were saying things like people ask for specialized things at grocery stores all the time, and they, brought up the example of like cakes, which is a completely different thing because...
Yeah, there's a whole infrastructure set up for
cakes.
Like, getting a blank cake and just writing on the cake, which only takes, a couple minutes anyway.
Exactly. And I almost wonder, like, if stores would almost have, want to have policies against staff peeling or preparing food for customers on demand without some sort of infrastructure in place, because they might start to have concerns about hygiene. So, having the oranges already prepped and in containers, you kind of suspect that those were prepared, hopefully, in hygienic standards. And so you don't have to start worrying about, where do I find a staff member to do this for me? And what if you have an anxiety issue that you don't really feel comfortable approaching people? And yeah, the thing that just really frustrated me is anytime like I engaged with someone, particularly off of Twitter where you have more than 140 characters, I would always like remind them, like, this is about trying to consider meshing environmentalism with accessibility, because those two things are so often mutually exclusive. And they would just like completely ignore that part of my argument and keep going with the yes buts on everything else.
Right. Instead of trying to, consider somebody else's viewpoint.
And I'm just like sitting there going, like, what do I have to say to you? Because most of them will kind of like pay some sort of lip service to like caring at some point about disabled people, but that this is just somehow not the issue. Like, how are we making this an issue? We're so greedy for trying to make this an issue. And so, like, they feel so justified in being like, I mean, sure, disabled people deserve accessibility, but is very much the narrative you get when you start to engage with people.
So you're a PhD candidate in disability studies, right? Why are people so resistant to the idea of ableism and accessibility in general?
That's so hard to pinpoint, because like so many people will like straight up say that like ableism isn't even a thing.
Yes, I get told that all the time by people.
I don't understand that, because I mean, I think most people understand that prejudice against disabled people to an extent is a thing. Like, they'll accept that people experience workplace prejudice and whatnot, although they generally expect to have like very concrete paper trail to prove it, or else they're like, are you sure, or are you just paranoid? But so yeah, like, I think it's mostly because, people are so obsessed with this sort of medicalized view of disabled people where we're supposed to be sick and trying so hard to get better and to be normal, that when we're just kind of like, no, we exist and we want access in the way that we currently exist, there's a lot of pushback to that, because they're like, you're supposed to want to get better, you're not supposed to want help, you're not supposed to want us to make things accessible for you, because if you just got better, we wouldn't have to do it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I was thinking a bit about, like using environmentalism as a guise for ableism, that like...
Well, I know that there was at least one person on Twitter who like basically compiled a number of like suggestions for containers that were, more environmentally friendly, and was like, hey, look, there are ways of doing this better. But did that go anywhere near as viral as the original post? Of course not, because that doesn't fit into their... sort of, we're being attacked and something horrible is happening to the environment because of these plastic tubs, which, as someone else pointed out to me, were actually resealable, so you could either, recycle or repurpose them. So it's not as
Yes.
though that they were something that immediately needed to be thrown out.
Right. And a lot of the other points that I've seen are like, well, what about the like plastic salad bags that are not reusable,
Exactly.
or
And
you know,
it's just like,
eh,
obviously the thing that will make them so angry is whether or not it's convenient to them. Because if you bring that up in the discourse, they're like, oh yes, of course that's a problem, but there's something about these oranges that is just somehow so much worse, even though you know that like they are making up the tiniest percentage of this waste, and
right.
that, salad bags and deli salads and things you get at the deli at the grocery store are probably making up significantly more of this as an issue. But, you don't see the same anger around it. It's this concept that it's so ridiculous. They're so obsessed with the idea that these peeled oranges are so ridiculous. And any suggestion that they're not ridiculous is just like there's a cognitive dissonance going on. They're unwilling to accept that as a possibility, that this may be no more ridiculous than getting an artisanal cheese.
Right. Well, the original tweet, if I go back to here, is the thing that like sparked this whole thing. If only nature would find a way to cover these
Yes.
oranges so we didn't have to waste so much plastic on them. Is that what makes it so ridiculous, that like oranges have a
I
peel, that
think
they're
like as
already self-contained?
Yes, I think so. And I think that people got so in, and I think there's also an element of, people saw a thing, thought it was ridiculous, and started getting really angry about it. And then suddenly there was some pushback of, actually, no, this isn't that ridiculous, and actually, this helps a minority group of people. And then people suddenly have to deal with the fact that they have inadvertently done something bigoted, and they
Right.
don't want to deal with that, so they double down, or they argue, or they try and rationalize why somehow it's not, or our arguments are invalid.
Right. And then there's also the flip side of like, God forbid any minority group gets any sort of quote unquote special treatment.
Dear God. Yes, exactly. It's like, you're getting a thing, except for the fact that anyone could have bought these oranges, so it wasn't even special treatment.
Yeah. Like you said in your piece that you quoted somebody saying peeled oranges have a shorter shelf life, so how convenient are they really? And then you said this is true. It indicates just how much planning has to go into living while disabled. You have to plan your meals around fresh produce and be more careful about that.
Is it the thing about it being accidentally accessible?
Yes, that's exactly what I was
I know
looking
I've gotten a
for.
few quotes around that one. Yeah, I think I need to start a blog series about things that I find accidentally accessible. Oh, you almost wonder
Yeah,
if the companies find out if they'll get pissed.
yeah. We'll pull them off the market. Quote, this is because things that are accidentally accessible are marketed and available to everyone and are thus likely to be more easily available than an accessible product, which will likely only be sold in specialized stores. And accessibility that requires no thought to implement is the best. Which is so true. Like, it would be so great if, things just were accidentally accessible all over the place,
And I mean, they sometimes are, but,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think disabled people are becoming very good at identifying those things and sharing them
Mm-hmm.
amongst themselves, but I don't think the mainstream really wants to deal with that at all.
Right. Another point that you make is the one around the cost of all of these things, whether it be adaptive cooking tools, which can be prohibitively expensive, or even the added cost of buying prepared food. Yeah, it is more expensive, but being disabled is expensive in general.
I know, first thought when I heard that, like, as an argument of, but it's so much more expensive than just buying an orange, and I'm like, welcome to being disabled.
Yeah.
Everything is more expensive.
Yep, yep. You have to go out of your way to like I find myself constantly, I mean, not exactly. This would be more true if I were a rich person who had like actual money, but like I would be constantly trying to spend my way out of discomfort and like inaccessibility because so much of the world is so inaccessible, and you wind up having to spend more money to, make things more accessible.
Exactly, like, which is why, like, I buy pre-cut vegetables because, I have difficulty cutting them myself. it's difficult to do safely without a specialized cutting board, which costs like $75 and I can't afford.
Right. How about guilt? Because I am somebody who cares about the environment, and yet due to, various factors related to my disabilities, I wind up being a very not environmentally friendly person, and I carry around so much guilt about it.
And yeah, I think we've gotten to a point in society where people are morally superior. Like, if you are, environmentally friendly, you do get bad looks if you don't, live up to what people's expectations are. Particularly if you are shopping at somewhere like Whole Foods, which is supposed to be, organic and,
Right, but we all know it's kind of a
it's totally
kind of a sham.
It's a cash grab in every possible way.
Yeah.
And so people are becoming increasingly comfortable saying things like that. And yet one of the first comments that I got after I posted this blog post was someone saying, "Thank you, because I've spent so much of my life feeling guilty for, not being able to live up to the ultimate environmental standards because I'm disabled and my needs just don't allow for it." And I think that's the big thing here is, we really do need the environmental movement to start looking at, the intersection of low-impact living and disability, and to start looking at ways to, make environmentalism accessible. Because, if you look through any of these sorts of, conversations, it very quickly becomes apparent that they don't care, and they just kind of want you to disappear off the face of the earth. If you require something that needs more plastic, or that is in any way consumptive, they're like, just don't use it. So apparently we're not supposed to use crutches or wheelchairs or leg braces or, anything that consumes. So it's just we're supposed to stay in bed and die, because anything that we want that goes against, some tenet of environmentalism is immediately wrong. And, a lot of these things, wheelchairs and crutches, those are, definitely necessary, and there's, nothing we're going to do about that unless someone actually goes around and says, is there a way to make a more sustainable wheelchair? Which is probably a lot longer down the line than, let's put peeled oranges in sustainable packaging. Right. Which is actually a feasible thing. This conversation is so ridiculous because it just didn't need to happen. There are, ways of getting around it. But
right. And it definitely didn't need to be so antagonistic.
Oh, God, no.
It had me thinking a lot about, futurism and, the kind of utopia, the, sustainable utopia that I think a lot of people, envision when they think about environmentalism, and how, as is the case in a lot of, visions of future utopias, disabled people don't exist there.
Yeah, and that's a real problem, this kind of very eugenic idea that somehow, someday, we're just going to cease to exist. That we'll either, they'll breed us out of existence, or that we'll be cured. And this is a pipe dream. Let's ignore the fact that so many disabled people don't want a cure.
Right.
Which is clearly a very important discussion, and, I fit into that one. But at the same time, it's just not gonna happen. Let's be real. It's not gonna happen. Sure, you may be able to find treatments and cures for certain disabilities, but as a universal thing, it's just not gonna happen, because you're not gonna find cures for everything. We live in a world that has a lot of systemic inequality geographically. And there's going to be places where people just don't have access to treatments that are available should they want them. So disability is going to be here forever. It has been here forever. It will be here forever. And I really wish people would, get with the program.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on, or?
I wish that, the people that are so antagonistic would actually watch this podcast, but let's face it, that's a pipe dream. And would really start.
All the people that would really benefit from listening to my podcast will never listen to it.
It's just because it sometimes feels like you're preaching to the choir. This blog post that I wrote about this issue is the fastest, growing in popularity of anything I've ever written. Like, I posted this at 10 p.m. Normally, if I post something at 10 p.m., it's not going to get read because you need to post something at, like, between noon and 3. But because this issue is so important to so many people, it was just like it's been shared so many times that it's been out for less than 24 hours and has already been read nearly 600 times.
Wow.
Which has never happened to anything that I've written. Anything that I've written that has been viewed more than that, it's been, you know, a slow grow. And so, I mean, it's definitely something that is very important to a lot of people. It is touching a nerve, and so it's a really important conversation. But if we do, under some magical circumstances, get the people who are being so antagonistic to listen to this, I would just like to reiterate again, please remember that we do want to be environmental as disabled people, but don't shut us out of the conversation by saying that, you know, this is too small of an issue that we should just give up because we didn't have it last week, so why should we care now? Because apparently we're not allowed to advocate for better access to things. And to remember that, like, the thing that you should be focusing on is not shutting us down, but trying to figure out how to make, you know, living green accessible to disabled people. And go read my blog, because then I write about some of the other issues that crop up with accessibility and environmentalism.
Yes, and your blog is fantastic. I will definitely link to it
in
the show notes. Yeah, so thank you so much for talking to me about this. I've been like watching this unfold on Twitter.
I know.
Like,
I tried to stay out of it. I tried
on?
so hard, but I was just like, I'm so angry. This is so ridiculous. I need to.
So ridiculous.
I'm just like, why?
I like cannot get past. I mean, trolls aside, because troller's gonna troll,
Yes.
like whatever. But like people who consider themselves environmentalists, who consider themselves progressives, and then are like ragefully resisting the inclusion of disabled people. Just what? I don't. Why would you waste your energy on this?
They just really want to believe that we're this tiny minority, and that, you know, our voices don't really matter because they're so sure that everyone else is on their side.
Yeah.
And they're probably right, unfortunately. That's just kind of how it goes. But it would be so much better if they would just include us in the conversation rather than just immediately shut us down.
Yeah.
So then I would also like to add, like, because I am sure part of this backlash was this kind of idea where they got this knee-jerk, oh God, I might have said something offensive, I must now rationalize, is to remember, like, as I said, I understand that knee-jerk reaction to that photo being like, why is this a thing? So, like, once it's pointed out that, you know, it may be a thing for a reason, that if you have already jumped on the bandwagon of demonizing something that turns out to then become ableist, is to remember that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you did something that was ableist, and you're perfectly capable of changing. So, you know, and, you know, jumping off of that bandwagon, or, you know, taking that bandwagon in a more inclusive direction. So don't just double down and rationalize. Actually try and fix the problem.
Yeah. What a world.
I know.
What a world.
I know.
Well, like I said, thank you so much for talking to me. I almost didn't have an episode this week, so this worked out perfectly.
Don't you love it when something just goes horribly wrong and suddenly you have content to create?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Anytime. Thank you so much for listening to In Sickness and in Health. If you enjoy the show, please take a moment to rate and review it on iTunes. And if you can help with transcribing our episodes, shoot me an email at insicknesspod@gmail.com. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. And don't forget to be excellent to yourselves and each other.